am with the very esteemed Ian Kemish. He has had a long career in diplomacy with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which we'll hereafter refer to as DFAT. He served as the High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Ambassador to Germany, and the head of the Prime Minister's International Division under John Howard. As the head of the Consular Service, he received an Order of Australia for his leadership in the aftermath of the Bali bombings. He's currently working in academia, philanthropy, and advising also in business. So, firstly, let's get to what we're really talking about today. Ian, you've had a 25-year career at DFAT, but what you've chosen to focus your book on is your consular work, notably as head of Australia's Consular Service. What's the difference between traditional diplomacy and consular work?
Interesting question. Hello everyone, it's great to be here. It's wonderful to be in this bit of, for me, undiscovered Australia. Australia really is the gift that keeps on giving. This is such a beautiful place. What's the difference? Well, you know, when many people think about diplomacy, they probably think a little bit like I did when I was a university student aspiring to join the diplomatic service. You know, think about being in the great capitals of the world, advising prime ministers and presidents, negotiating treaties, all those sorts of things. And fortunately, I was able to do a bit of that over the course of my 25-plus year career, and that was all really fulfilling. But I quite deliberately chose to write about a much more earthy side of the department's work, where you can draw a very straight line between yourself and reality and real human beings, and that's what we call consular work. So let me just pull back and try and describe what that is to you. There is this group of people, group of men and women, both at our posts overseas and in Canberra, whose job it is to step forward when their fellow Australians encounter very serious trouble overseas. That work comes to public mind at times like, well, you've heard that the Bali bombing was in my past, but you know, more recently there have been a range of big international crises, kidnappings in Papua New Guinea. We can all think of it, high-profile prisoner cases. So you might think about that kind of work, but believe me, that is absolutely the tip of the iceberg. What people don't entirely understand is that in what I might describe as peacetime, you know, between these big crises, every 24-hour cycle, about 5 Australians are dying overseas. About the same number are being hospitalised and coming to the attention of the consular service. 3 or 4 are being arrested every 24 hours. So that's happening, and it might seem surprising, and believe me, my message is not that travel is dangerous. You've got to keep it in proportion. You've got to think about how many millions of us are travelling, and it quickly comes into perspective. So, you know, the figures that I've just sketched for you are quite recent. As travellers, we're ramping up again as Australians. We're not quite back to where we were in 2019, but we're close. 1 million of us left the country for one reason or another last December, compared to 1.2 million in the same month in 2019. So it's not surprising that in some cases, few cases, people encounter trouble, and for many of these people, well, for most of these people, the consul, the consular officer, is the person that they meet and encounter at what is literally the worst moment in their lives. Those are the people I've written about in the book.
And so, I mean, in the last session, you heard a lot about celebrities. We're going to talk to you about the celebrities you should know about, which are the consular officials around the world who have saved many Australians or looked after their time, looked after, you know, them in the worst times of their life. So it's it will get a little bit heavy at various stages, but we also will, I think, have a few more amusing stories. So
We can lighten it up.
yeah, sit tight. So I'm sure all of the young people in the room now would like to know how you got started in diplomacy.
Well, I was one of those young men who took a little while to work out what I wanted to do, to be honest. I drifted into a pretty straightforward humanities degree at the University of Queensland. I always knew I wanted to do something international. I'd grown up in Papua New Guinea. My parents had had a very adventurous life. They'd met each other in Nigeria, of all places. And you know, the international world, cross-cultural stuff was always such a thing in the family. And I had an instinct I wanted to go there, but it took me until my mid-20s to sort myself out a little bit, go back to university, sort out my degree, turn it into a good honours degree in Southeast Asian politics and history, and apply to join the service.
Is it common too that that people joining the diplomatic service in Australia, that they've already done a few more things before they get there?
Very common. In fact, it's almost a rule. Foreign Affairs, in its selection process over decades, has liked to, by all means, recruit people who have great academic qualifications. Can be in international relations or history, but actually we have mathematicians, all sorts of people who join Foreign Affairs. But they also really want a bit of lived experience and a bit of, demonstrated ability to get out there into the world and deal with it. So that's much more common than not.
In your early years at DFAT, how was consular work viewed?
Well, if they spoke about consular work in our Foreign Affairs training course, I don't remember. I really don't remember. And I think that reflected attitudes of the time. You know, I joined Foreign Affairs and Trade in 1988. I don't want to demean the work that consular folk had done in the years before that. Because there'd been some great people who'd done some wonderful work on some difficult issues. But generally speaking, the people who ran the joint, the mandarins who ran Foreign Affairs, the ambassadors, those sorts of people, and they were mainly blokes, tended to regard consular work as, something the janitors did. It was necessary, and if forced, would agree that it was important. But it wasn't really work which they prized particularly. They were much more focused on the political engagement and all that kind of thing. Things were already changing when I joined, but there was such a small group of people who did this work. There were streams. There was a consular stream. These were people who were, if you're in the military, they'd be the NCOs. They're the non-commissioned officers. People could never really aspire to get to the top. And they never could get to the top. So, consular work was thought of like that until the late 90s, I think, to the mid to late 90s. I had a few encounters with it on some of my first postings, and, I remember dealing with a very difficult case and breaking all the rules on my very first baby posting in Southeast Asia. But also my brother-in-law, who was a DFAT officer, was killed on posting in Vanuatu in an air crash, and that exposed me, even though he was one of Foreign Affairs' own, that exposed me in a different way to these kindly people who do this work.
And I think, what's striking about the book is how many events in there where Australia was deeply affected by, foreign events. There's a lot of events that are the where were you when kind of events that we all think about. And I was reading, there was a very, big one of those events that I was reading it, and Ian and I had the same experience of finding out about it. So tell us about where you were when you found out about the bombings, not the bombings, goodness gracious, the planes crashing into the World Trade Center.
Yeah, I mean, that was... I've reflected on September 11 as as a turning point. I think that's what I've called the chapter. In so many ways, it was such a fundamental inflection point in global history, in our understanding of the world that we lived in the way we think about terrorism, the way we think about travel. But on the day itself, I think I had been head of the consular service at that point for probably something like 18 months. So I'd had a bit of experience, and I dealt with a few other big problematic issues at that point. But to answer your question, Claire, like you, I was on the couch watching West Wing. And
it was an episode which was about a terror attack on America. It was bizarre.
Yeah.
And then it came on the news in the final ad break.
Yeah, and I fell asleep in front of the television, and my wife kind of poked me and said, "Come on, you love this show, wake up." And and we saw the first aircraft go in. My folk at the 24-hour Consular Emergency Centre rang me, and we looked at this and we talked about it, and I said, "Well, Susan, let's ring around, let's organise a meeting, I don't know, 7:30, 8 in the morning, just to be ahead of the media curve, because there'll be an Aussie on board that plane." There always is. And of course, when the second one went in, everything changed, and I was certainly rapidly on my way into the department. The taxi driver and I listened to the news on the radio, and he refused to take a fare from me because he understood broadly what I was about to go and do. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, how much work is there for the Australians at September 11? In the end, it was a deeply American tragedy, and almost 3,000 Americans lost their lives. It was a moment of enormous anxiety for the Australian public, and in the end, only, and we shouldn't say only, but in the end, 10 Australians lost their lives either in the air or in the buildings that day. We thought there could be hundreds, and we knew this. As we prepared through the night, we knew that as soon as we put that free call 1300 number out on the breakfast television screens, that we'd be hit with a barrage, because this is before mobile phones were really prevalent. They existed, but people didn't tend to use them. So we had an enormous advantage. Those attacks took place in Eastern Australia, 10:30, 11, something like that, and many Australians had gone to bed. So most Australians didn't know what had happened. So we had until the early hours to get ready. And DFAT officers whose normal work might be working on, China or Antarctica or whatever, were drummed in to man the volunteer phone lines, and when the 1300 number came up, we were smacked hard.
And what kind of things?
We took thousands of calls in the first morning.
And what kind of situations were they dealing with?
Well, people are just naturally anxious that their loved one might have been affected by this, and in most cases, actually was no reason to worry. But the trick for these people doing the work is to work out when you have to focus and when you have to pay attention and when you have to follow up. And we had hundreds of cases of which we thought were of serious concern by lunchtime that day. Winnowing that out, sorting that out, progressively establishing who you really had to worry about was what the work involved. And we'll probably get onto it later, but that whole experience made me and others think, gee, what if this was in our neighbourhood, and what if we actually had a big operational responsibility as well? We need to get our act together and lift our capacity to deal with this situation. Thank God we did.
And how did the Australian diplomatic corps change, and the consular work that you were doing change after that event?
It was already changing. I think the government of the day had recognised that the world was changing, that Australians were travelling in ways that they never had, and that ultimately people like you, a society like this, should have an expectation that there's a professional response in these situations. there's a whole other set of issues about how much we should expect and how much responsibility we should take ourselves, but let's not go there just yet. So people were increasingly focused on that. People like me, so-called policy people, were being shifted into the consular service. I think I was the first person with my kind of background to run the consular service, and increasingly it was being thought of as a place to go that was good in career terms. And the message from our very hard head of department at the time was, get administrative experience, get corporate experience, and get consular experience, because if you don't have it, you're not going to get to the top. You can no longer take that narrow view of what diplomacy is. This is a reality and you've got to deal with it. Public expectation, media expectation, I think had a bit to do with it. So the culture of the place was changing dramatically, and the resourcing had to change. You know, we had to get real when it came to to how we equipped the service.
One of the events you talk about too was that, you know, you do get pressure in Australia when certain other foreign countries are behaving in a different way. For example, the UK government was, you know, had flown families over to New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I know exactly where you're going with this. It was all Tony Blair's fault, right? So just to help understand it, the view still is that if you're not covered by insurance and you incur serious hospitalisation costs or medical evacuation costs in an overseas location, or if you regrettably die and your body needs to be returned to Australia, the government does not pay for that. The expectation is that you will have insured yourself and you will cover the costs, and there are people who have had to mortgage their homes because they've made that mistake. That remains the case for consular work generally. There are these moments, though, where governments, for political reasons I'm actually not going to argue with, decide that they're going to set that aside. And September 11 was a moment where Tony Blair decided that he was going to put on a couple of jumbo jets for the families of the presumed, victims, of British victims of September 11, to go across to New York and be there and so on. And we could all see what was happening. The media were, besieging Alexander Downer's office, saying, "Well, come on, what's Australia going to do?" And I was ringing the office saying, "Think about this really carefully. Think about the precedent, because you're potentially about to make quite a big decision." And in the end, Downer rang me, to his credit, and he said, "Look, you're not going to be happy with me, but we're going to do it. We're going to pay for this." And I actually didn't see it as a black day in the consular service. Others did. But then there was another moment later, and I'm sure we're going there, with the Bali bombing, where we threw that book out the window. And in the end, I've thought about it a lot. I've got no argument with it. Yes, it's hard to say the death of your loved one requires this response, but the death of your loved one in ordinary times requires a different one. But there are these moments of national crisis where we all expect something different, and I don't have a better answer to it, but it's one of the conundrums that you have to deal with. And so September 11 was a watershed in that sense too. We broke into new ground, and there's a whole new set of expectations about what we do at these big, high-profile crisis moments.
So you were awarded the Order of Australia, an Order of Australia for the leadership after the Bali bombing. How did that unfold?
It was so different. I mean, it was only a year, 13 months between the two events. Among other things, the mobile phone had become so much more ubiquitous in that short period, and these, I'll call them what they were, kids who were at these two nightclubs in Bali, largely kids, all had mobile phones. So all those advantages we had 13 months previously, being able to work through the night, plan, get ready, none of that. With the Bali bombing, I mean, people were ringing in from the scene to the Consul Emergency Centre, and there was screaming in the background, and people not being able to find their sister, wife, husband, whatever. So it was absolute live time, and their parents were on the phone. The media was all over us, and it requires for all of us, it requires a real focus on task when you're in that situation. You actually have to find ways of deflecting all of that and staying focused on task, because again, unlike September 11, we actually had operational stuff we had to do, because what people are conscious that we did a big medical evacuation. One of the remarkable things, and it says something about Australia, one of the remarkable things about that response is we didn't just evacuate Australians from Bali, we evacuated everybody who required medical attention from Bali. We evacuated Indonesians from Indonesia. And when you think about it, in many cases you couldn't, sorry to go there, but you couldn't actually tell ethnicity, never mind nationality, by looking at the victims. It was a very, very different kind of thing, requiring, a huge response from the Australian Defence Force and a range of other agencies that we just threw in there, and my own people who I just kept throwing on planes and deploying.
Why did Australia have to step up and lead that?
Because
crisis?
we were the only country in the region who had the capacity to do it. Both the capacity to conduct such a huge aeromedical evacuation, but also the capacity to absorb the victims. I'm thinking just about the first phase here, the victims back here in Australia. I made lots of mistakes in that crisis, probably did more things well than mistakes, but at the same time, one of the mistakes we made was not anticipating how much we needed to engage with the health authorities back here in Australia, because of course, everyone poured into Darwin Base Hospital, and Darwin Base Hospital was overwhelmed, and then people had to be redistributed across the country to Perth, to Brisbane and elsewhere. So it actually was a national crisis, not just an international one, and I still think there's not one quite like it since.
And I mean, this is so much about what your colleagues have done. Can you speak a little bit more about in those couple of days after a crisis like that? What are people doing in Canberra? Like, are you sleeping? How do you actually manage that level of a crisis?
Well, first of all, I always caught a taxi into a crisis because I knew I wouldn't be able to drive home. Of course you have to sleep. You've got to pair yourself with somebody. Interesting thing about crisis, and there'll be people who've done crisis leadership in this room, the more senior people actually, the managerial people, the people you've got to worry about, because you get into roster systems and all sorts of stuff with the troops, if I can call it that, but the leaders kind of forget that they need a break too, and if they wobble, then the whole thing wobbles. And lovely fellow called Chris DeCure was my counterpart. He's passed away far too early, Chris. But he and I paired each other for that period, and what I would do is I would give my mobile phone to the crisis centre and say, "You've got my home phone, I'm going to bed," and I'd go and I'd sleep and I'd be back in a few hours. That's what I would do. And I would also have an EA or somebody manage my mobile phone, because you just can't be doing that and making it happen.
And what happens on day 3 of a crisis?
Yeah, so Claire's referring to this moment. I used to talk about day 3 syndrome in a crisis. I was already talking like that by the time the Bali bombing came round, and it was really true in that case. And this is not disrespectful of the media, this is just the way things seem to work. There is a narrative that develops over time, and is it a media narrative or a public narrative? I'm not sure, but those first few days, it's all about the horrible event. The story is about, people stepping in and the rescue being launched and all that kind of thing. So in a media sense, it's a reasonably benign environment to work in. But then what happens, and it was really the case here, was, the family's victims arrive at Denpasar Airport. The media has arrived, is arriving. No one has good answers for these people. The question of identification, your staff are still sorting themselves out. The question of identification turns out to run for months because it's so difficult. And there are a lot of people in anguish and who express themselves, and the media's there to absorb it. Journalists are human. They identify with the people that they're interviewing. And there's a lot of anger. And day 3 is when the story turns and the government's not doing enough and it's all a disaster and what a mess and what incompetence. The ironic thing is that, it has another phase a year later where you're all getting awards of Australia and you're being depicted by the same media as the heroes of the day. It's kind of fascinating how it works.
I'm just going to skip ahead. I would say that, we'd all understand that diplomacy can be a world where your wins are not acknowledged openly. The work that you do, it's behind everything. What do you think is your greatest achievement behind the curtain that nobody knew about at the time outside DFAT?
I think it is about lifting the service up. It's not the most exciting answer I can give you, but it really was a cottage industry once, and stimulated by all this stuff that happened around me. The Asian tsunami happened a couple of days after I finished in the consul job, and to me that was proof it hadn't been all my fault, because all this other stuff had happened in my time. But stimulated by all of that, we really did reform that service, and that's not something that was visible particularly to people from the outside. I'm really proud of the culture of the time and the people, and in the end, you talk about the culture of the consular service and the men and women of the consular service. These are Aussies, these are Australian men and women, and the story of what they do is the story of what Australian men and women do, and that's what's so cool about it. Did I deflect your question well enough?
Well, and if you're uncomfortable talking about yourself, you tell a story in the book of a colleague as he navigated a tricky situation high up in the Himalayan mountains, wedged sort of on the border between Nepal and Tibet.
Lyle Crawford's his name. Lyle is now a master fly fishing instructor somewhere on the northern New South Wales coast. And he tells this story better than I do. I had forgotten this story. It happened under my watch. But when I was researching the book, Bill Jackson, a mutual friend, said, "Don't forget about Lyle's story." And I went, "Oh, God, yeah." And I rang Lyle up and I got him to tell the story. So Lyle is not what you think of when you think of a diplomat. His Ned Kelly beard is part of his image, or at least it used to be. I think he shaved it off now. He was into martial arts. He was on posting in 2003 at the tiny little mission we have in Kathmandu in Nepal. And he'd already had a couple of, I think 3 Chinese language posts, so he had fluent Chinese. He'd really worked hard on his Nepali, and he spoke that well as well. You've got to understand that the little embassy in Nepal, among other things, finds itself rescuing Australian mountaineers who've encountered trouble on the high slopes of the Himalayas from time to time. But this one was a doozy. This one was a group of Victorian police officers who were spending their leave each year climbing some of the highest peaks in the world, leading up to climbing Everest. And they got in awful trouble high on the slopes of Choi Oyu, which is the 6th highest mountain in the world. They were on the Chinese side of Choi Ayu. They weren't in Nepal. They were in Chinese Tibet, a military zone. And one of them died. Their leader died at something like 7,000 metres. And with the help of Sherpas, they brought his body down to 5,000. This guy, his name was Paul Carr, had promised his family he was going to come home, and his mates were determined that was going to happen. There's this so-called rule of the mountain that if you die on it, you stay on it, but they weren't accepting that, and they were going to bring the body home, and they also needed rescuing themselves, and they somehow got through on a satellite phone to Lyle Crawford in Nepal, and much, much closer than Beijing, thousands of kilometres away. And Lyle kind of absorbs their situation and thinks, right, how can we do this? And he gets off the phone, starts to workshop what he needs to do. He quickly understands that the choppers that are normally used for this kind of rescue can't go that high, can go nowhere near 5,000 metres, and the only helicopters that can are the ones run by the Nepalese military, Russian-made helicopters. So he rings in his best Nepali the chief of the Nepali Defence Force, who says, well, it's in China, so you're going to have to get permission for us to do this. Yeah. You're going to have to pay for it. Yeah, that's easy. Even our best pilots don't know that part of the Himalayas, so we need maps. So Lyle sets off. He goes down to the mountaineering shops in Kathmandu, buys up all the contour maps he can. The other condition was you're going to have to come to Lyle because we need you as insurance policy with the Chinese. And here's an interesting point. Different state in the relationship between Australia and China these days. We actually got permission from the Chinese to conduct a joint consular operation in military-controlled Tibet. The then Chinese foreign minister rang our acting foreign minister to give him the good news. This is where relationships count, right? Yes, you can do it. So they chop it in. It's an extraordinary journey. I hope I'm not being too long, but Lyle told me, oh yeah, I put on my suit, and I said, why are you wearing a suit? And he said, well, you know, people take me more seriously when I wear a suit. So he puts on his flak jacket, and he's got petrol all over him by the time they get there because they have to stop at a mountain pass and leave fuel for the return journey. He describes finding these people as looking for a couple of shakes of pepper on a huge white tablecloth. They found them. There'd been a mix-up with the body. The body had been left in a place where the helicopter pilot couldn't access. He tried, risked his life trying to, but couldn't do it. And the helicopter pilot said, you tell your fellow Australians we're getting out of here. That body's staying. They're getting on the helicopter, and all that stuff they're carrying, that's not coming. They're getting on this helicopter with what they've got in their pockets. So they flew back absolutely disconsolate that, you know, they couldn't bring Paul home. Lyle rings up the Chinese deputy who has helped secure this, deputy at the little mission in Kathmandu, and says, thanks for your help, we got the survivors out. And he said, you didn't get the body? He said, no, we didn't get the body. But we arranged you a 48-hour visa. You can go tomorrow. You can go back tomorrow. So they did. The body had been moved to a better location at that point, and they brought him home. And get this, this is a true story. Lyle, at the end of all of this, returning to Kathmandu at about 10 in the morning, because they'd gone off at dawn on their second trip, second ordeal, finds his way back to the embassy compound, which is both where he lived and worked. And there's a couple of Aussie print journalists there to interview the ambassador about this issue, and they see this embassy employee arriving at 10 in the morning, and one says to the other, gee, it's all right for some, isn't it? They were a bit embarrassed when they met him later.
So always, I think there can't help but be a tension between the public service in Canberra. I grew up in Canberra as well, so I'm very aware of this. Between the public service and the need to adapt the policies of the government of the day. How do you manage that? And how did how have you dealt with that through your career?
Look, I think if you're in public service, in the end you believe in a simple principle. It's called democracy, right? You can have your own views and your own beliefs and your own ideology, but in the end you have to respect that the politicians who are there are the government of the day, and that the people of Australia in their wisdom have decided that they're the government of the day. That's how the whole system works. So there are moments where you find yourself thinking, well, I don't really agree with this policy, but, and I certainly have had a couple of cases, and one I'll mention in a minute, but that's not to say that you can't argue the hell out of the situation behind closed doors. That used to be a really strong tradition in public service. I'll swear I used to. I can think of cases where I really pushed back hard on politicians about what they should do and how they should do things. And certainly the generation before me were quite famous for it. I worry when I see things like, the sort of public service testimony before the Robodebt Commission. It just sort of, I worry about what happened to courage. Because in the end, policy is policy, and no one elected me, so I don't get to decide what it should be. But in the end, you should really argue the case. And I can think of a couple of experiences where I've pushed back hard. I was dealing with a ridiculous crisis in Papua New Guinea where we had two prime ministers vying for the position. Both thought they were prime ministers. It got pretty nasty for a while there. They appointed their own chiefs of defence force, chiefs of police force. We had two of everything for a while in Papua New Guinea, even governors general. And I was the guy trying to help sort this out. And my foreign minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, wanted to come in and help. And I was the one on the phone saying, no, you're not coming to Papua New Guinea. It's not in your interest. It's not in the Australian government's interest. That just cannot happen. And, he took my advice, and in fact he made the point, you can look it up on Hansard, he made the point that he received that advice from me. So there's an example, but also, the immigration authorities established the Manus Island Asylum Seeker Processing Centre during my time as High Commissioner in Papua New Guinea. And particularly on the way it was implemented, I argued very hard behind closed doors about all of that, and it really is about implementation. I think the way it was carried out, I think we all recognise it was a bit of a disaster in the end, and I kind of wasn't there for all of that, but I was there at a key moment where I argued, for example, about the kind of refugees who should be coming to that place. I argued very strongly against families and children being there. But anyway, it's the point is the government of the day gets to decide, and when they've decided, they've decided. But as a true public servant, you argue the case.
And you have served under 5 prime ministers. I was actually surprised by what you mentioned about the similarities between John Howard and another prime minister.
Yeah, people are surprised by this, but and I'm speaking here about. I'm not speaking about politics. I'm talking about how people are interpersonally and how they show respect or not, and how they engage with people. But two people who had consistently showed courtesy and respect in engagement with individuals in my own experience were John Howard and Julia Gillard. I mean, they and I've had the good fortune to work more recently with Julia in her role as chair of the Global Partnership for Education. Wonderful person. And if you can, set aside the politics for a moment, at that level, at that level of courtesy and engagement, very similar people.
So there's always a bit of a tension when there's really publicly known cases, and I think one of the more difficult things, and you talk about it, I think rather generously. You talk rather generously about the media in your book, I think. But where are there cases where media and public knowledge about an event really affects a situation to its detriment? And I am thinking, about people that are banged up abroad, for want of a better way to put it.
Yeah, look, I've reflected on this a lot over time. There was a particular case, and I'd spent a chapter on it, where I found myself deeply involved and essentially posted myself as charge d'affaires in Laos in order to try and get this couple out of jail, because it was becoming such a high-profile case. People tend to have forgotten the case now. Their names were Kerry and Kay Danes, and they were imprisoned in Laos in 2001. But I reflect a little bit on that case, and I certainly felt at the time that I understood why the father of the woman in question went to the media. If you're a father in that situation, you're going to try everything you can. But I actually feel like we lost months because it went public, and because the Lao authorities got put on the back foot and felt like it was very hard to extract themselves and climb down from the situation. And in many ways, the trick to getting this couple out was to convince the Australians to calm down. Once we'd done that, the Lao actually followed quite quickly. That was one experience. There have been other cases, more recent cases people are probably more familiar with. A friend of mine has been kind enough to write something on the front of the book, Peter Grester, who was imprisoned in Egypt back in 2015, I think. The public campaign for Peter's release was slick, sophisticated, smart, done collaboratively with government. Undoubtedly was a great example of how to work in that way, and helped spring him from Egypt without a doubt. So there are these examples. The most extreme example at the other end of the spectrum I can think of is a sad case, I think, that of Chappelle Corby in Bali, where the public and the media went nuts and certainly didn't help her at all. So I think that's an issue. But look, the other tricky experience I've had is in that very difficult period after day 3 and with Bali, where identifying the dead became such an issue for all of us. I mean, we had one case where 6 families with absolute conviction identified the one body as their loved one. And in one case, the individual was a high-profile person and was being backed by a shock jock, not the one that was mentioned in the previous session, I won't say who, by a shock jock back here in Australia, give him his wife back. And my Kim Lam, young woman in her 20s who I dispatched to Bali in those first hours, found herself going back into that body bag and coming out and saying, "Did your wife have a navel ring?" To which he replied, "No," and she said, "This is not your wife." That was the situation, and people got very mixed up through that period. And I think we all had to go on a bit of a public education process in understanding how complex and how difficult it actually is, and how certain you have to be before you sign off on identification.
We're sort of nearing the end of the session. I do want to have a little bit of time for questions. I really want to touch on what you're talking about the expectations of what diplomats can do in these circumstances, and how they've risen over the years as well. Like, what are some of the more ridiculous things that you've come across in your consular career that Australians abroad have expected the embassy or the High Commission to achieve for them?
Can you look after my pets? I'm going away for the weekend. Can you organise opera tickets for me? I haven't heard from my mate. He's been travelling for a couple of years. I'm worried about him, but I also want to get his motorbike out of my garage. These are real inquiries recorded on the consular lines. There's a bit of that, there's plenty of laugh about it, all of that. But don't get me wrong, most Australians, by far the majority of Australians, are actually reasonable people. I think we're very reasonable travellers, and the proportion of people who turn to the service for help in the first place is less than 1% of travellers. But and then there's this extreme where people just seem to have different ideas. You've got to ask yourself, what do you expect the government to do for you here in Australia? Do you expect them to intervene and sort out your legal issues? Do you expect them to arrange burial? Do you expect the government to step into your life in that kind of radical way? We don't tend to, but for some people, the expectation gauge changes when they leave the country. And please don't get me wrong, I actually think that Australians should expect a professional consular service, and the cottage industry that I inherited back at the beginning of the thousands is no longer appropriate for today. But we do have to keep asking ourselves where personal responsibility begins and ends when we travel overseas, and for God's sake, travel insurance. People think about it as being about lost baggage or flight cancellations. Least important reason to take it out. It's all about the medical and hospitalisation costs. Literally, there are literally cases of people having to mortgage their homes. And it's not just in places you might think of as unsafe. You end up without travel insurance and you're hospitalised in the United States, you're in very serious trouble.
Shall we take some questions? Oh, there's a good few there.
Hi.
Hi.
Very interesting talk, by the way. But given our current love-in with America with regard to submarines, do you have any, or are you able to make any comment on our lack of success in trying to stop Julian Assange being taken to America?
Yeah, I have to admit I have evolved a bit on the subject of Julian Assange. Just bear with me for a minute, because the beginning of this won't necessarily be popular in this room. But in the end, I'm somebody who comes out of the world of international security and international diplomacy, and I actually believe that it's important to protect and keep private government information. I think it's important for our national security. So I'm not somebody who approves of Julian Assange's activities, and I certainly don't think of him as a journalist, no matter how unpopular that may be in this room. However, enough is enough. And this has been going on far too long, and I think you're right. I think that the focus should rightly be, I expect it is, should rightly be on the American system rather than the British, because in the end, if the American request for extradition disappears, then the whole situation disappears. I'm not privy to what's going on there. I certainly heard our Prime Minister speak, actually in similar terms to the way I've just spoken, early on after he was elected. So my guess is that there are conversations going on. In these societies, though, it's not just the executive arm of government that gets to decide. Courts have to go along with it, and the American system can be very slow. I'm hopeful about it. It needs to be resolved. Absolutely needs to be resolved.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm assuming that your book had to go before the DFAT lawyers before you could publish. How much did they redact, and what sort of things did they not want you to go public about?
Really good question. I can tell you honestly, zero. Zero. And you know what? I'll tell you how it happened. I thought I'd like to write this book, and I had this conversation. UQ Press P had been talking to me about it. You got a book in there, and I thought, I'll write about this. I rang Frances Adamson, who was, great friend, who was then the head of DFAT, and said, Frances, I'm thinking about this. And she said, oh, great. She said, we can give you your clearance back, and your top secret clearance, and you can have a look at the files and so on. I thought, thanks. And I went away and thought about it, had a quick informal chat to the consular folk and said, I don't want my clearance back, I don't want the files, because it's going to put me in a situation where every chapter is going to have a clearance on it until you've decided that it's okay. What I'd like instead, I said to DFAT, is access to serving DFAT officers so I can interview them. And yes, I'll run the book past you mainly because I don't want to break the law, I don't want to breach the Privacy Act, and I don't want to breach the Official Secrets Act. I still don't think I was required to, but I did anyway. I gave it to them. They didn't change a word, not one. But it's not surprising. I actually used to run that side of the DFAT business myself. I know where to draw the line. And it's more that this is why writing about this side of the service is actually a bit easier, because this is out there in the open. I was able to write this book from the public record, from memory, from the memory of others, largely. But I did them the courtesy by running it past them, and they told me I was wrong on a couple of occasions, and they were right. But that was just facts, people's names, that kind of thing.
Another question.
Ian, Keith Gardner is still dining out on the Himalaya rescue story.
Yeah.
We can discuss that later. But I'm aware of the lengths that consular officials go to in extraordinary situations around the world, in Fiji during the coups, in Tiananmen Square during the military crackdown in 1989, particularly in politically charged circumstances. You've talked about the Himalayan rescue. Are there any other anecdotes that come to mind that give some sort of insight into the lengths that consular people go to that the Australian public sadly are never aware of?
Yeah, I can tell a quick story in response to that. But first of all, thanks for mentioning Keith. Keith was, remember Lyle? Keith was Lyle's boss as ambassador in Nepal at the time, and previously had been my director of consular operations during September 11. So he's in the book, and I interviewed him for it as well. It's an unusual story, but I like it. There's a young fellow called Monty Pounder. At the time this took place, I think 2015 is when Miran Sukumaran and Andrew Chan were executed in Indonesia. At that time, Monty was a young go-getter third secretary, first posting at the embassy in Jakarta. He hadn't joined as a consular person. He was a young, general diplomatic officer. He'd thrown himself at the job in Indonesia. He had absolutely brilliant Indonesian, and he found himself as part of the team that was supporting the families of those two men around the time of execution. The execution took place in Java, not in Bali. They were moved to Java. And he was asked to be part of this team because of his local knowledge, because of his ability to get things done. And he was watching what his consular colleagues were doing in support of the families of these two men in pretty nasty circumstances. I mean, the way the Indonesian media and some officials behaved around this time was pretty difficult. And they're in this small town in remote southern Java where the executions would take place. Monty decided that there was a mission he needed that had meaning that he needed to take up, and that was getting hold of and preserving and getting to safety Sukumaran's art, his paintings. You might recall that Ben Quilty took, quite an interest in Miran Sukumaran, and in those last 24 hours before he was killed, he was prolific in what he produced. Monty's actually from around this part of Australia, actually, but his father owned an art gallery, knew all about preserving art, and so Monty's on the phone from Java, sort of sorting out exactly what he needs to do. When they finished, when the executions took place, he joined the long, silent bus ride back to Jakarta with the families of the victims. But before he did that, he took these paintings and stacked them up in this hotel room, which is actually normally a brothel in this part of Java, and jammed the air conditioning on. Got on his computer, typed up some kind of contract, God knows what he was doing, with the Indonesian hotel, that they would leave this room alone. You've got to bear in mind there's a lot of paparazzi, a lot of aggressive journalism taking place at the time. And he sets off back to Jakarta. It's a 15-hour drive back to Jakarta. And in the end, Monty decided he was going to go back and he was going to get these paintings himself. Yes, somebody else could have gone. Yes, he was exhausted, but he wouldn't forgive himself if someone else had mishandled these paintings. So he and an embassy driver ended up constructing boxes for basically constructing them on location, just outside this hotel, packed them all up. Monty bizarrely slept the night in the same room. He reflects back why the hell he did that, but he slept surrounded by these images that night and managed to get them out to Jakarta and ultimately to Australia. And as you might know, they've actually been, I think they may still be on the road as a travelling exhibition in what is a standing condemnatory statement about capital punishment. So it may not be the story you expected, but it's a story of somebody feeling like he had something important to do and that he had to do it well.
Do we have time for one more, or?
What do you think, crowd? What do you think? One more?
Has anybody got one more? Well, maybe we don't. Oh, behind you.
I was just wondering, when you speak about the role of the public service in relation to the government of the day, and regarding issues such as robo-debt, where there's conversation and discussion and argument behind the scenes that ultimately has a result, and looking at the investigation into robo-debt now and what resulted from all of that, and how people make up their mind behind the scenes, what to do, that moral question as to, there are going to be consequences for this government policy, and, it does not look good, and it's going to be real for people.
Yeah.
And when do we say, no way in the world, I'm not going to let you do that, or I'm going to step out, or I'm going to resign, or whatever? I mean, because that must be part of what happens behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think it is. And look, I have no special knowledge of what happened behind the scenes with robo-debt. I'm like the rest of us, just watching. I have a particular interest in the testimony and the reasons people give. I've got very little patience with the line, well, there was a culture of fear. I mean, for God's sake, put your pants on and face up to the situation. Because in the end, I'm not sure people even fear losing their jobs. It's a fear of being marked down, which is a pathetic fear. There are people who stick to their guns, and there are people who either extract themselves from the situation or resign. But I guess that's why I mentioned robo-debt, because on one hand, what I hear and see worries me, quite apart from the impact on people, which you rightly point to. I suppose the hopeful side of me says that, says this must be being absorbed and people must be learning lessons from this, because there are some fundamental mistakes that people made, and that's being paraded on the television in front of us.
We have one more, but I think we need to wrap up. So thank you very much, Ian. I highly recommend the book